Welcome back to GB News. You're watching the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir John Redwood, who stood down at the last election, having been the Conservative MP for Wokingham since 1987. John, let's just start with that, because you were going to stand and then you felt that the early election call was a mistake and that you might lose. What happened? Why do you think Rishi Sunak decided to do this? Because Nadine Dorries is apparently writing a book about all this, and maybe he had second thoughts at the last minute. It's been reported today, but he had already told the King. But it seemed nuts from an economic perspective because the green shoots of recovery were starting to show.
Yeah, I didn't think I was necessarily going to lose. I thought the Conservative Party as a whole was going to go down to a tragically big defeat, and that proved to be right. And then the campaign made it even more likely that we would do worse than the original polling. The original polling showed Wokingham was just about winnable. No, my decision was that I'd been working, I thought, closely with Hunt, Sunak and their advisers on general economic policy, and I thought if we left it until November, December, things were going to look a lot better. We could have had some mortgage rate cuts. Even the Bank of England got round to cutting interest rates as soon as the election was over, and there could be more to come. I thought that we could do a much quicker job on getting public sector productivity back up to 2019 levels, which would have freed about 20 billion of extra money for tax cuts, which would have been very helpful. I wanted another so-called fiscal event or budget in September, October, and had put forward a series of tax cuts that had been targeted on self-employed small businesses, on cost of goods and so forth. And if you had another 6 months of actual real incomes rising, because real incomes had started to rise just before the election, I thought that was all a better background where we'd have limited the damage.
Yeah.
And I was working away with them on these things.
You've been vindicated in these feelings.
And then they just said no, so I had to make a very quick decision. I thought, I can't defend this. I can't defend the decision to go early. I can't defend where we are at the moment. You couldn't do it with words. You had to do it with deeds. We needed another 6 months, for example, to show that we were getting legal migration under control. It was another thing I and a few others had persuaded the government to do. They eventually got round to it in January. If we'd had a whole year of showing the numbers coming down, people would have been reassured.
But take us inside some of these conversations, because there's you talking political sense. You're representing the electorate's desires. This is what Conservatives are asking for. Can we bring down legal migration? Can we please have incentives for businesses to thrive? Can we please be taxed less? Could we be more productive so that our public services work better for us? You go in and you say this to the likes of Sunak and Hunt, and they're nodding, saying we agree, but we can't implement it because officials in the background are saying no, no, no.
Well, sometimes they agreed. I mean, as with the legal migration, they did actually put in some very sensible measures in January, but they didn't hang around to see the benefits. Labour can now claim some credit because the numbers have started to fall, still too high, but coming in the right direction. On something like the Bank of England, where they are willfully selling bonds at huge losses that they needn't be doing, they didn't want to intervene with the Bank of England. Well, that was always a joint policy. Chancellors signed off on the buying and selling of bonds. That was part of the deal. And the Bank of England made it very clear that they were acting as agents of the Treasury. And we, the taxpayer, are paying for those losses. So I was scandalised that I couldn't persuade the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to say to the Governor, look, the ECB is not doing this, the Federal Reserve Board is not doing this, though they have the same problems as the Bank of England. So why on earth is Britain having to charge its taxpayers billions of pounds every year for selling bonds you needn't sell at a loss?
No, well, it's quite granular, this, and I'm practically functionally enumerate, so I struggle to understand anything economic. But I think I get the basis of what you're saying, is that the Bank of England is selling bonds at a loss and actually costing us money, and yet there seems to be no accountability by the Bank of England for doing this. As you say, other central banks aren't doing it. So what's happened here, John? Is the Bank of England out of control? It's now setting fiscal policy? Independence has spiralled beyond what was originally intended by Gordon Brown? What's happened?
Yes, indeed, because I wasn't a critic of their independent right to set the short-term interest rate and to do what they do through the Monetary Policy Committee. But that was the limit of their independence. And when Brown and co wanted to print a load of money and buy a load of bonds because of the collapse they engineered in 08-09, the bank very sensibly said, this is too hot for us to handle. We're going to send it all through to you, and we need a Chancellor's signature on this, and Parliament could have opened that decision up for comment if they wished to. So that continued. So all of the money printed over COVID was signed off by the government. And I was critical of the latter stages of that.
Yes.
I agreed with the first 300 billion, which was a colossal sum of money because they were collapsing the economy. The next 150 billion was in the recovery period. I always thought that was inflationary.
Yes.
And yet they still did it.
But because what you're saying, I interviewed Liz Truss recently, and she is resentful about the idea of her mini budget crashing the economy, says the figures don't suggest it did crash it. And actually, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, and the Bank of England they weren't honest with her about this LDI's problem. So, I mean, is there a finger to be blamed, a finger of blame to be pointed at Andrew Bailey and co? Seems to me that the Bank of England has extended its reach far beyond its original remit and isn't performing particularly well for the British taxpayer. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, indeed. I mean, the Bank of England itself has recently come out with some analysis saying the bulk of the interest rate rises that occurred were the result of the LDI crisis and their actions in raising rates. They wanted interest rates higher. That was why they went up. And it wasn't just in Britain, because the Federal Reserve Board was doing exactly the same thing in America. So you had bond prices falling and interest rates going up universally. There's an argument about whether the Truss budget caused an extreme version of that. I mean, I think the Truss budget was ill-judged. The spending was far too high. I couldn't understand why they were subsidising your and my energy bill. We didn't need that and we couldn't afford it. But that wasn't the main problem. And as you rightly say, the main problem was the Bank of England had lost control of the pension fund investments in bonds, including their own. They had a huge position in these very damaging funds that were highly leveraged. And so I think that's probably why they reversed policy. And they showed that as soon as they reversed policy, the market stabilised. So it was mainly the Bank of England that destabilised the market, and they knew how to stabilise it. The other thing that people forget is that interest rates went higher a year later after stabilisation than they were during the Liz Truss period.
But as a unashamed sort of Thatcherite, how do you feel about this idea that the Tories have squandered their reputation for economic competence? I mean, you now look at YouGov polling, for instance. It says that Labour is more fiscally disciplined than the Conservatives. That must depress you as a lifelong Conservative.
Well, it annoys me because I was trying to get them not to be fiscally irresponsible. I mean, going right back to COVID, where Iron, led by Mark Harper, led the charge to lock down less and to lock down for a shorter time period because it was just unaffordable. It was crazy. And that was the main cause of all those problems. That led to the excessive money printing and the inflation which we got, which has damaged the reputation. I fear that Labour are not going to be fiscally cautious in the way they advertise because they've already put out a very big unfunded set of pay rises for the public sector with no matching productivity. Now, I would like a better
of the effect.
I'd want a better paid public sector, but it has to be earned, and there are lots of productivity changes that could be made that would justify all that. Well, my worry is that far from turning us into the fastest growing economy of the G7, a great aim which I fully support, they'll do the opposite, because practically every measure they've announced or heralded so far is anti-growth.
Yes.
And they are going to make it much more expensive to have energy in Britain. They are going to close down our car industry, making petrol and diesels more quickly than the previous government was. They're going to carry on with the policy of taking us out of basic steel making. They don't seem to be very energetic in promoting more homegrown food. All the things you could be doing to grow the economy sector by sector, they're doing the opposite.
And what effect as well, we read this morning, that they're not going to be actively encouraging civil servants and others to be working from the office. Apparently the Home Office is struggling to get employees to work in the Home Office in person for more than 2 days a week. Do you think that has an effect? I know Jacob Rees-Mogg did a lot of work in this area. Well,
I think it can do. But I mean, I work at home quite a lot, so I don't rule it out. No. But it needs properly managing. And I think there are more occasions when people need to be in an office talking to colleagues and being mentored by seniors and understanding from their managers directly. It's much more difficult doing it on video links. So, yes, I think you need strong managers in those departments who carry their staff with them and get the balance right. And I think probably the balance isn't right at the moment. Can we just move you on to the Tory leadership race? What do you make of it? Is it too long? It's a marathon, not a sprint. We don't get the results from the membership vote on the final two until I think it's November the 2nd or 3rd. No, I'm not critical of that. I mean, I think there's an argument for it being longer because I think the members need to be engaged, because there's a great danger that the members are going to drift off. We've lost a lot of members already because of bad policy in the last few years. A lot of members didn't like the immigration policy, they didn't like the economic and tax policy. So I think you need to woo the members back. So I think engaging them very fully in the way this does is an extremely good idea. And I think those who are contesting it, and there are a lot contesting it at the moment, who stayed in the government throughout and never gave any indication that they thought something was wrong, have got a lot of work to do to persuade people because they were taking the ship down.
Does that mean that you might be backing Robert Jenrick because he did resign over immigration policy?
I'm not making any statement about who I'm supporting at the moment. I want to let them all have a chance to set out their policy positions. I'm a fair-minded man and I'm just a member with a vote. And at the moment, what matters is what the MPs are going to do, because, of course, they have the crucial votes to whittle it down to 4 and 2. But I hope they will do so in conjunction with their members, those members who remain, because we feel we have a right to a say as well. But no, I will want them to set out a better programme, but I want them to be much more explicit about why it went wrong and why they didn't do anything about it.